Okay,
Okay, we good?
we're good.
Okay, thanks again, Charlie. Again, hello everyone. My name is Kevin, he, his, him pronouns. I won't go over my introduction since Charlie did. I have some cats who, when I start talking, they always come to me and want to be petted, so hopefully I won't get too distracted by them. I would also, my appetizer is, I would be a jalapeno popper, just because I love jalapeno poppers. Again, like Charlie said, I'm going to speak to you all about our legal observer program here in Columbus. Very proud of it. We have a lot of very dedicated volunteers doing this work in Columbus and throughout Ohio and throughout the country. And I want to give some background on the National Lawyers Guild because this program is operated through the National Lawyers Guild. So I'm going to give that context, and like Charlie said, I'm going to also go through how one can be trained to be a legal observer, and towards the end of the training, some of our experiences over the years, including once when my colleague Amna Akbar and I testified at a criminal trial as legal observers. So I'll go through that as we progress through this training. But like I said, first I want to give some background on the National Lawyers Guild. So Charlie already gave some information. But the National Lawyers Guild, we're an association of lawyers, law students, legal workers, jailhouse lawyers, striving to support abolitionist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist social justice movements. It's been around since 1937, the first racially integrated bar association. The Legal Observer Program was created in 1968, so that's been around for a long time too. So we have here in Ohio and in Columbus, so we have a statewide chapter, the Ohio chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, and I'm a board member for the state chapter. We also have different local sections and law school chapters. So here in Columbus, we have a group of lawyers, law students, some social workers. Don't have to be a lawyer or even a law student to be a part of our group. We welcome anyone as long as you have the same values as us. So in Columbus, we have our local section, and there's a chapter at OSU's law school, Moritz, and I'm not sure if there is one at Capitol Law School. I think there is. I'm not sure how active they are. But Columbus, so there used to be very active years ago, and it kind of dropped off. And right after the November 2016 presidential election, everyone remembers that time. We were all panicking and nervous about the future. And my friend, Amna Akbar, some of you may know her, she's a professor at OSU's law school, brought many of us together back in that time period. A lot of law students, a lot of lawyers, to talk about how we could organize as a legal community and how we could support movements and radical movements. And so I want to give a shout out to Amna. She's one of the smartest, most brilliant people that I've ever known, and just really appreciate what she did to bring all of us together and how she radicalized us and gave us the proper focus. So we started meeting as a group back in 2016, 2017, and we eventually became a local section of the National Lawyers Guild here in Ohio. I also want to give some background on a concept called movement lawyering. So legal observing is one way that we can support local organizing, local leftist radical movements. But there are many other ways that we can support the community, support organizers, support movements. So in addition to legal observing, which is a big part of what we do, our Columbus National Lawyers Guild local section, we do a lot of other work. So we've organized like know your rights trainings for the community on rights as a protester, or we did one a few years ago, rights of immigrants and interactions with ICE agents. We had some attorneys, immigration attorneys, give a training on how to interact with ICE agents and people's rights and things like that. So that's another way we can support the community, is by sharing our knowledge and expertise on these types of issues. We've also, so we have regular meetings. We meet about once a month, and we try to educate ourselves too. So going through law school, again, most of us are either in law school or finished law school and are attorneys, licensed attorneys. There's a lot of things that we learned in law school that are just not true, or gave us the wrong frame of mind. So we make an effort to educate ourselves. So we had James Hayes from Ohio Voice do a presentation to us a few months ago on just organizing 101, like the basics of organizing and movements and things like that, to have that right frame of mind. We were also involved in the Mama's Day bailout. Some of us were. Tabby Woodruff, I don't know if she's on the Zoom call today, raising money to bail out Black mothers who are in jail or prison, and which eventually morphed into the Columbus Freedom Fund. So we were involved in that. We were involved a few years ago in the Issue 1 campaign, which some of you may remember. So those are just examples of ways the National Lawyers Guild here in Columbus have been involved in movements and organizing. So, and also we've been partnering with Columbus DSA on eviction defense and tenant organizing. Rachel and Jesse and Melissa from the NLG here in Columbus have done a lot of great work in educating people throughout the city on their rights and organizing tenants. It's pretty scary now, as we all know, as evictions are happening right in the middle of this pandemic. It can be very scary, obviously, and during any time, but especially during a pandemic. So, and of course, we've been trying our best to support the current uprising here in Columbus, which has been so beautiful and so powerful, the Black Lives Matter protests. Just so proud of our city and everyone out in the streets. It's been, like I said, just so beautiful and so powerful. So movement lawyering. So again, this is something that we're just not taught in law school. We're taught how to be gatekeepers and how to basically like traditional lawyering. And there's a lot of good that we can do as lawyers, but it doesn't change like the underlying problems in our society, poverty and capitalism and systemic institutional racism. That's not going to happen through our legal system, right? Like I said, there's a lot of good that leftist progressive attorneys can do. For example, working in legal aid and defending a single mother who's facing an eviction, or public defenders who are defending people in the criminal justice system. Like that's meaningful and it's important. But again, it doesn't change the underlying root causes of the problems in our society. So movement lawyering is a different way of, and when I'm talking about traditional lawyering, I'm talking about like progressive leftist attorneys who may work in a nonprofit or for a government agency or something like that. I'm not talking about like, most attorneys do a lot of harm in their jobs, right? Like corporate lawyers or prosecutors. I'm not talking about them. They're obviously upholding systems of oppression and injustices. So movement lawyering. So that's taking a different perspective on how the legal community, how lawyers, how law students can support movements, can support organizers. So the way hopefully I'm not lecturing or preaching, but the way change is made, fundamental changes are made in our society is through massive grassroots movements, collective action that builds power, that addresses the root causes of the harms in our society. So like I said, poverty, capitalism, systemic institutional racism, and led by those most directly impacted by these oppressive systems. So instead of lawyers taking charge and saying, we just need to work within the system, we just need to file lawsuits and things like that, this takes a much different, fundamentally different approach to the law. And so how can we support these movements and organizers who are working on the ground to change things, fundamentally change things? So it's a recognition that there are just structural limits to the ways that lawyers alone can bring about positive changes to our society. So again, we can do some good things, but we're not going to fundamentally change our society through the legal system. In fact, the legal system is, in many ways, upholds a lot of the oppression and injustices in our society. And it's a recognition that most of the harms in our society are perfectly legal, you know, and there's just no real legal recourse for a lot of the problems in our society. And I'm not an expert on PowerPoint, as you could maybe tell. So I tried to include some nice pictures in this presentation. So many of you know Ruben and Amber, who passed away in recent years, very near and dear to our hearts here in Columbus. Just some of the best human beings that I've ever known, organizers. I wanted to honor them in this presentation because I miss them and I love them and think about them all the time. So, mass defense. Mass defense is basically a system of legal support that enables people, or attempts to enable people, to express their First Amendment rights and political views without unconstitutional, unlawful disruption by law enforcement. So legal observers is part of this system of mass defense. And so I was just talking about movement lawyering. So mass defense is, in our view, a way of supporting movements, supporting organizers on the ground who are out in the streets, who are protesting, who are organizing. So again, legal observers, jail support, criminal defense, civil rights litigation. This is all, those four elements comprise mass defense. So let me see what my next slide is. Okay. So we have legal observers, trained legal observers, who are out in the streets with people who are protesting or having a rally or having a march or some other type of demonstration. And we're there to, and I'll get into more detail about our role, but we're there to monitor and document what law enforcement is doing. And so that is one part of mass defense, but like I said, it's not the only part. So if we're at some type of protest or demonstration or march or rally or whatever it is, and we, which has happened often in the last few months, witness or observe arrests, that's when the second part of mass defense happens or comes into play, which is called our jail support. So jail support, I think I have our jail support number in here. I'll eventually get to it. We have a jail support hotline, a statewide hotline number for people who are arrested, who are protesting or demonstrating and are arrested by law enforcement, and people who are protesting, who are in line with our values. So Black Lives Matter protesters, for example. So legal observers connect to our jail support team, which is off-site, and make sure, so one of our main duties as legal observers is to find out who was arrested, if possible, get their names and birth dates, and we pass that information along to our jail support team. So again, they're off-site, and they're recording this information in like a giant spreadsheet. There have been a lot of arrests the last few months, as I said, and so that that jail support team will again take down that information, whether it's from a legal observer or people in the community could call our jail support hotline and say, my friend or my family member was just arrested. I'm really worried. I don't know what to do. They're going to need legal representation, things like that. So they would also be entered into our jail support team system. And we eventually want to get to a place where, so as of right now, our jail support team is connecting people who are arrested and charged criminally with criminal defense attorneys. So that's the next element of mass defense. People are going to need legal representation if they're criminally charged at a protest. As of right now, that's the main role of our jail support team, is to connect people to legal representation. So right now we have some people will be eligible for a public defender. We can help connect them to a public defender. We do have a list of private criminal defense attorneys as well, who have volunteered to work with us. Some of them pro bono, some not. Unfortunately, in Columbus, we don't have a legal defense fund. It's something that I've always wanted to do. So some people, depending, I mean, if you want someone who's a private criminal defense attorney who's super experienced and has a lot of resources and like I said, a lot of experience in criminal defense matters, it may cost you some money. I mean, some attorneys may be willing to do it pro bono, but some may not, and that's an expense, unfortunately, in our society. Some people, assuming that they're eligible, like I said, could go with a public defender. So making those connections to people who are criminally charged and need legal representation, that's another part of mass defense. And then civil rights litigation, there was this is the fourth part of mass defense. Obviously different than any criminal proceeding, but a civil rights lawsuit, for example, a group of very well-respected civil rights attorneys here in Columbus, including Sean Walton and his firm, and Fred Giddis and Ed Foreman, filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Columbus Police Department and the city, alleging widespread constitutional civil rights violations during the protests, throughout the protests in the last few months, which is very exciting. So that's another way to hold law enforcement accountable for unconstitutional, unlawful behavior, conduct. So hopefully you can see how all this fits together. Jail support, just to add a little bit more to that, hopefully we want to eventually get to a place where we're providing a greater level of support to people. So a lot of people who are incarcerated, who are in jail after being arrested at a protest, they may have certain needs while they're in jail. So they may need their medication. They may not have their medication on them. They may have some unique medical needs, and they may need someone to advocate for them, someone outside the jail, to alert the officials at the jail that this person needs their medication, or they have some type of medical needs. They're going to be very hungry and exhausted once hopefully bail is posted and they're released from jail. So having someone like a friend or a family member or someone from the jail support team picking them up from the jail and maybe having some food for them, some snacks, some water, and making sure they get a ride home, like that's another level of support, another way we can support the community, the movement. So eventually we want to get to that point where we're providing that level of support. A lot of this, so we've had a pretty robust legal observer program here in Columbus for several years. A lot of this stuff we kind of just created from scratch in late May when the protests here in Columbus began. So we're still working through issues and trying to improve, and a lot of people are tired, but we're trying our best to support the movement and to support protesters. So hopefully that makes sense, the mass defense concept. So specifically, legal observers. Legal observers are trained by the National Lawyers Guild. It's usually an hour, hour and a half training that we ask everyone to go through before they can be a legal observer. Typically, lawyers, and that says lawyers and lawyers, but should say lawyers and law students. But anyway, we have a lot of non-lawyers, non-law students who are legal observers, trained legal observers. Doesn't require any special like legal expertise or knowledge or anything like that. Again, we just ask that people go through a training, and then they would be directed by local NLG attorneys. We do have some exceptions. For example, if you work for the police or law enforcement or prosecutor's office or any similar type of government agency, or you have a close relationship to one of these entities, then you cannot be a trained legal observer just because of the conflict of interest. And we handle a lot of confidential information, especially people who are arrested, and we can't put people at risk. So we have that exception, and it's important, and we enforce it. So legal observers, we wear bright green, yellow hats to identify ourselves as legal observers. So you can see that picture on the right, and the person on the left there who's talking to people who are created that chain, which is cool. So as I said before, legal observers, our role at protests, rallies, demonstrations, marches, our primary role is to monitor and document law enforcement behavior towards demonstrators, towards protesters. So we, depending on how risky the action is or how big it is, sometimes we'll have several dozen legal observers. Sometimes we'll just have a few if it's just a rally at the State House and it's just, a few people. And if there's like civil disobedience being planned, we would obviously be more on alert and have more people there and be more prepared. But our primary role, like I said, is to monitor and document law enforcement behaviors. So we're there to have our eyes on what law enforcement is doing. That's our primary role. We serve as a witness to law enforcement misconduct. So if there are, and there, like I said, there's been a lot of criminal charges since the protests began in May, and we've witnessed a lot of violence and a lot of brutality by the Columbus Police Department here in Columbus against peaceful demonstrators, peaceful protesters. So we could serve as a witness. I mean, it's going to take a while because the legal system's so slow for these cases to wind through the system, but we could be a witness in criminal proceedings for people if we witnessed misconduct, brutality, violence, excessive use of force, illegal searches and seizures, things like that. We could testify at criminal trials. We could testify at civil trials. So we could potentially be witnesses in Sean Walton's federal lawsuit down the road that ever goes to trial. We could provide declarations, affidavits in these civil and criminal proceedings, give depositions. So those are the ways that we could support people either in criminal or civil proceedings, in addition to connecting people to jail support. So I guess those are our two primary functions: monitoring and documenting what law enforcement is doing for use down the road in criminal and civil proceedings, and also when people are arrested at a protest, making sure we get their names, their birth dates if possible, and connecting them to jail support so we can provide them a level of support, including connecting them to legal representation. And so the third bullet point there also says, serve as a deterrent to unconstitutional or unlawful behavior. So that is, at least theoretically, if we're there and we have our green, yellow hats on, maybe law enforcement would be less likely or think twice about brutalizing someone or being violent. But in my experience, they just don't care and they're not deterred by our presence, which is sad. But that's at least theoretically a function of legal observers. So we do not. There are a lot of things that we do not do. And there's some confusion about this amongst people in the community. We're not there to give legal advice or political or tactical advice to demonstrators. First of all, because a lot of us just either aren't lawyers or don't have the expertise to give good advice to people. We don't want to give the wrong advice, right? So that's one reason why we're not giving advice to demonstrators, especially like during the protest. But we try to maintain a line between demonstrator and legal observer. So one of the things that we train legal observers is try not to get arrested because you can't do your job if you're arrested. So we do, we do put ourselves in positions where, which are risky and which put us at risk of arrest, especially if someone's being arrested and we're trying to get in the middle of a group of police officers to try to get their name, like that's risky. And also, legal observers are often targeted by police. That's happened in Columbus several times, at least in my experience. It's happened across the country as well. I think there were arrests in, if I'm not mistaken, Brooklyn, arrested a number of legal observers this spring. So trying to maintain, we show up for this movement and we're in alignment with this movement, but once we're there as legal observers, we try to maintain some level of neutrality so that we can do our jobs and monitor and document what law enforcement is doing. So it's a way to ensure that we're able to do our jobs, basically. We don't talk to police, or at least we train people not to talk to police. We don't negotiate with the police. We don't act as police liaisons. Sometimes they try to talk to us, but at least we train people just to ignore them and not say anything. We don't participate in the demonstration, or we try not to interact with demonstrators, which can be hard because we see a lot of our friends and comrades who are at these demonstrators, and we usually say hi and give them a hug real quick. But again, the purpose of that is to at least publicly maintain that neutrality so that we can do our jobs. We don't try to interfere with arrests, detentions, or searches because that will go very poorly, first of all. It's very dangerous, it's very risky, and they have the power, they have the weapons and equipment, and we're just not gonna win that battle even if we tried. So it can be hard. I just in the past few months, I've witnessed so much violence and brutality by the Columbus Police Department, and it's traumatic, and it's hard not to try to stop it from happening. But like I said before, you're just not going to be successful. And the more important thing that we can do as legal observers is to document and record what we've witnessed, because that will help the person hopefully down the road. We don't engage in crowd control, otherwise attempt to influence crowd behavior. Don't speak to the media. We don't document demonstrator behavior. So that's something that's very important, which I'll get to when I talk about the Black Pride 4 case and trial. We're not going to write down in our notes that we saw a protester doing this or that, or get them on video or anything like that, because that could be used against them in a criminal proceeding, for example. Okay. So we train legal observers to be visible, to stay at a comfortable distance, but close enough to monitor and observe. Like I said, we want to, at least publicly, avoid blurring the line between demonstrator and legal observer. Although I think law enforcement kind of just treats us all as the same, which I don't know that there's really a way around that. I said this earlier, we train our legal observers to avoid being arrested. We can't fulfill our duties if we're in police custody. We're often targeted. We're often put ourselves in risky, dangerous situations. We also, when we train our legal observers, we train them about their First Amendment rights, their constitutional rights. but we're also very careful to acknowledge that law enforcement often, very frequently, does not respect people's rights, and you're left with trying to defend yourself in a criminal proceeding or enforce your rights, your constitutional rights, in like a federal civil rights lawsuit, which is very time consuming and expensive and stressful. So my point is, I should give an example. You have a right to record law enforcement with your phone or with a camera. You have a constitutional right under the First Amendment to do that, and courts have held that. So, but if a cop says, "I want you to stop videoing me," you can say, "I have the constitutional right to do that. I have the First Amendment right to do that." But they could say, "I don't care. I'm arresting you anyway." So, and then, like I said, you're left fighting that in court, which would suck. So we always advise our legal observers to use just their common sense and recognize when to back up and to take them out of these dangerous situations. If a police officer says, "I'm going to arrest you for recording me," I personally would take a step or two back, especially if it looked like they were serious and if an arrest were imminent. And they would also argue, you can't record me if you're disrupting or interfering with my duties. So there are some limits to your First Amendment rights. And so my point is, we tell people, we train people to use their common sense when they're out in the streets and their rights are frequently violated. Their constitutional rights are frequently violated. So we document, as legal observers, we document with written notes. That is our primary way of documenting and recording. We tell our legal observers to bring a pen and a pad of paper to document things like law enforcement presence. So if we're at a rally or a protest, and it's the state troopers because we're at the Ohio State House, they have jurisdiction over the Ohio State House. Or if it's the Columbus Police Department because it's anywhere else in the city, basically. We would document that. We would document how many police officers are there, whether they're wearing riot gear or on horseback or on bicycles or things like that. So we document that. We document instances of excessive use of force, or pretty much any use of force. So I'm sorry if this is traumatic for anyone to hear, but there's been a lot of instances, as people who've been in the streets know, a lot of use of pepper spray and mace and beatings, wooden rubber bullets. It's been just, it's been hard to believe some of the things that we've seen the last few months from the police here in Columbus. So we document that when we see those, seen those things, observe those things, any harassment, any search and seizures, any arrests, obviously too. So I mentioned earlier, if we see people being arrested, we try to get as close as possible to get their names and birth dates. Or if we can't, we will ask people who may be close by, do you know that person? Do you know their name, their birth date? We're from the National Lawyers Guild. We're here to support this protest and support the people who were arrested. Sometimes if we know in advance and have a good relationship with whoever is planning the protest or demonstration or whatever it is, we will suggest that the group have a list of names and birth dates kept off-site somewhere. That makes our jobs easier. If there are arrests, we can track them down in the system, find out where they were being taken, whether the Jackson Pike jail or the jail downtown, find out what they were charged with, find out what their bail is, when their arraignment's going to be, things like that, just to pass that information along to their criminal defense attorney. and documenting, if we do witness arrest, documenting whether people suffered any injuries. That's another thing we document. Wanted to add that. If arrests do occur, in addition to getting people's names and birth dates, we'll document the time, the location, the method and manner of arrests, the number of people arrested. There could be mass arrests that happens, which it makes it really hard to get people's names and birth dates in those circumstances, but that happens. So documenting as much as we can that can be helpful, either in the moment to pass along to our jail support team, or could be helpful down the road in criminal proceedings, or if there's a federal civil rights lawsuit like Sean Walton's lawsuit. So again, just to emphasize again, I know I keep saying this, but we're there to monitor and document what law enforcement is doing and hold them accountable. Let's see if I missed anything in my notes. Yeah, so I should have mentioned this in this slide. We prepare people in advance. So I'm the legal observer coordinator here in Columbus, and whenever we get a request from someone in the community, if they're holding some type of protest or demonstration, rally, march, whatever it is, and they need legal observers, we have like a Google group where I send out an email and say, there's this protest happening this weekend and they need legal observers, who's available, who's willing to show up and volunteer. And then we will have whoever is available and willing to be there. We'll have like a legal observer team there. And we advise everyone to write the jail support number on their arm, just in case. So we advise our legal observers as well as protesters and demonstrators to do that, just in case they are arrested. We communicate through Signal. We discuss beforehand like strategy. So if it's just like a rally where people are gonna be in the same place for a few hours, and like maybe there'll be some speakers and some chanting and songs and things like that, then we'll just kind of spread out and make sure have our eyes on law enforcement. If it's a march, then we typically pair up in groups of 2 and spread out throughout the march. And again, make sure that we have our eyes on law enforcement. Could be some other type of demonstration or an act of civil disobedience or something like that. Organizers in Columbus are very creative, especially with these types of risky actions. So it all depends on the circumstances, but we'll strategize beforehand and decide how we want to approach this protest and how we can best monitor and document what law enforcement is doing. We advise people not to bring anything they wouldn't want confiscated by police. So I bring my phone. We always tell people to lock your phone, turn off the cloud backup, use a numerical passcode instead of a fingerprint. They can actually, law enforcement, if you are arrested and they confiscate your phone, they can force you to use your fingerprint to unlock your phone, but they can't require you to use a numerical password. It's just the way courts have interpreted people's Fourth Amendment rights. So we advise people to use that numerical passcode. Some people are hesitant to bring their phones because they don't want them confiscated, which I can relate to, but I don't like being without my phone. So, but anything other than that, I'll bring my ID just in case, and some water and a mask, obviously, but I don't bring anything else. We also train people not to wear like neutral clothing, just so we can have that appearance of neutrality. So, yes, okay. So I want to give some examples. I think this is my last, sorry. I have about 10 minutes before I want to open it up to some questions. Just want to go through some examples of the ways that we've supported protests here in Columbus and movements. So obviously, since late May, we've been out in the streets with protesters, demonstrators, and the current uprising, the movement for Black Lives Matter. It's been so exciting, so beautiful, so powerful, also pretty exhausting. But we're trying our best to continue to show up. And like I said earlier, we've just seen the response from the city and the police department, the Columbus Police Department, has just been horrific. And many of you have been out in the streets downtown and throughout the city and have experienced it or witnessed it. So just so much violence and militarized response, and pepper spray, mace, beatings, arrests. It's been shocking to experience, and it's been traumatic for a lot of us. Nothing like what the Black community has experienced in this country for decades and centuries, but it's the trauma that we've experienced is real, and has been hard for some of us. But we're really dedicated to showing up and supporting this movement. So I'm proud of us for being out there. The Black Pride 4, I wanted to speak about that briefly. So many of you know about this case. Happened back in the summer of 2017. I won't go into a lot of details because I think everyone's familiar with it, but very briefly, a group of Black activists were arrested at the Pride Parade here in Columbus. They briefly blocked the Pride Parade, trying to bring attention to the lack of intersectionality and just systemic racism and institutional racism in our society. And the recent acquittal of the Minnesota police officer who shot and killed Philando Castile. So it was this act of civil disobedience in downtown Columbus, and 4 of the Black demonstrators were arrested pretty brutally and criminally charged with disorderly conduct and some other misdemeanors. So a few of us were there as legal observers and observed everything: the arrests, the brutality, the violence against these demonstrators. I mean, they were eventually convicted of misdemeanors because they were blocking a parade route, but it was peaceful and it was very powerful. So the case went all the way to a criminal trial, and Amna, I mentioned her earlier. Amna and I were both there as legal observers, and like I said, witnessed pretty much everything: the arrest, the brutality, the violence. So as legal observers, we testified in support of the Black Pride 4 and what we witnessed, what we observed. And so I was really proud that we were able to show up for those 4 and support them. Like I said, they were eventually convicted just because our legal system is so corrupt, and really the only focus of that trial was, did they commit a crime? It wasn't these broader issues of racism and police violence and things like that really wasn't factored into the jury's decision. They were instructed, did they block the street? And I don't know that there was really a dispute about that. So they were convicted, but the Black Pride 4 just created a lot of energy in Columbus, a lot of difficult conversations, and but really brought a lot of attention to intersectionality and racism, and just created this really beautiful movement in Columbus. And I'm very grateful for Be Quick and the Black Pride 4 and others who have been pushing these conversations and doing all the work, all the organizing. So we're very proud to have supported those 4 and support that movement. We've done just countless. Sadly, there's been a need for so many protests and demonstrations because the Columbus Police Department and their officers have killed so many Black people in Columbus: Tyree King, Henry Green, John Thomas, Julius Tate Jr. That's not an exhaustive list. And organizers in Columbus have been very active and very passionately pushing back against just the violence in our city by the police and condoned by the city. There have been just countless protests over the years. And so we've shown up for that movement. We've been legal observers at protests and demonstrations and marches and rallies to support that movement, support families. That's a picture of Adrienne Hood, mother of Henry Green, speaking publicly. She's a beautiful person. So we've supported that movement. Maisonique Saunders, so she was, you may have heard of her, the girlfriend of Julius Tate Jr., who Julius was shot and killed by Columbus Police Department officers. Julius was 16, Maisonique was 16 at the time. Maisonique was charged under the felony murder rule with Julius's murder, even though it was the Columbus Police Department who murdered him. So there are a lot of protests surrounding their criminal charges against Maisonique. The ADAPT protests. So you can see that a lot of the organizing and movements that we've supported here in Columbus have been focused on racial justice and police violence. That seems to be where the movement and organizers are so strong here in Columbus, especially the last few months. But there are other groups and causes that we support. So I wanted to mention the ADAPT protests. Those were back in also 2017. 2017 was a pretty busy year, that same summer. And that was a group of people who used wheelchairs, people with disabilities, who protested at Senator Portman's office. This was around the time when Congress was trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which would have included basically destroying Medicaid, which is an extremely important federal program, health insurance program for people with disabilities. So this radical group called ADAPT, a number of them came to Senator Portman's office in downtown Columbus and had a very energetic protest in the lobby of his office. And we were there as legal observers. There were a number of arrests, pretty violent arrests, people being removed from their wheelchairs and transported. These are people with power wheelchairs. And so like very serious medical conditions and disabilities, and removing someone from their wheelchair is very dangerous and can lead to serious injury. And they were separated from their wheelchairs and transported to jail without their wheelchairs. Many of them described it as similar to what Freddie Gray experienced in Baltimore. Some people suffered injuries, some people could have suffered serious injuries, maybe even could have suffered fatal injuries, being transported in such a dangerous and reckless way. That's another example of a protest, the ADAPT protest. My first legal observing experience was back in 2016, summer of 2016. That was the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, and that was an interesting time. That's a long story. Many of you probably remember when a KKK affiliate was in Dayton last spring, the No Hate in Dayton. There was a massive counter protest to confront I think it was like 5 or 6 KKK dudes who demonstrated in downtown Dayton. So we traveled to Dayton and supported that protest. The Muslim ban protest, also back in 2017. Some of you may have been at that protest. That started off as, it was planned as only a couple hundred people, but eventually there were thousands of people downtown at the State House, and eventually marched to the county courthouse and then marched back. And a few hundred people occupied the intersection of State and High and there was eventually arrests and use of pepper spray and violence and brutality by the police, which led to a federal lawsuit by the ACLU of Ohio against the city and the Columbus Police Department for excessive use of force and battery, assault and battery, for using pepper spray in the way that they did, which I remember being so alarmed by that back in 2017. And just, that was just another day here in Columbus in the last few months. Just that was happening almost every day for at least a few weeks, just the use of pepper spray and violence by police. So for the Muslim ban protests, the ACLU of Ohio lawsuit, many of us were there as legal observers, and we contributed declarations, which are basically affidavits to the court about what we witnessed, what we observed that evening about police using pepper spray and just their pattern and practice of violence and brutality against peaceful protesters in Columbus. So that's a way that we supported a civil rights lawsuit, a federal civil rights lawsuit, as legal observers. And we hope to be able, if people need our support, like I said earlier, to support people if they decide to take their criminal cases to trial, or if the current federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and the CPD, as that moves forward, we're very eager to support that lawsuit and share what we observed and what we witnessed, because like I said, we've seen a lot the last few months. So it's 1 o'clock, so I wanted to open it up to questions at this point. We can, Charlie, do you want to, how should we do this? The chat or unmute people?
Let's, there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I want to uplift those.
Sorry.
So why don't I read off some of them so you can answer, and then we'll just like have people unmute themselves for anything else that you want to discuss.
Okay.
I marked a lot of questions here, so I apologize if I didn't get yours. Feel free to say it yourself. So first one I'll say is, what happens if you observe misconduct by a counter protester?
Ooh, that's been hard. So misconduct by a counter protester against one of our people, I assume that means. That can be hard because, at least in our society, like the recourse is to call the police, right? Or at least that's what people are expected to do, but we don't want to involve the police in those types of situations. So that can be hard, especially for abolitionists, right? Like we don't want to involve the criminal justice system or involve police. We don't trust the police. So I don't know that I have a good answer for that. We have witnessed some scary threats and actual violence by counter demonstrators. And yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. It's our focus is on law enforcement. That's our primary function. So we try to stay aware of counter demonstrators, and we do document, like if there's a difference between how law enforcement would handle like right-wing protests, like the demonstrations at the State House a few months ago, like the anti-mask, the Reopen Ohio demonstrators, like that, there was such a clear distinction between how they were treated by law enforcement in Columbus, right? And how the Black Lives Matter protesters have been treated. Just such a clear distinction, not surprising to any of us, but oh, someone just typed something. I meant if the police.
Yeah, there's a lot of typing. Leah kind of had the same question as Bob, but also said like, are you required to answer any questions about the incident as an observer? So definitely about like, what happens if you see something that's from our side that's not good or legal?
No, we're not going to document that, and we're not going to share that with anyone. We're there to support people, our organizers, this movement. So yeah, we're not going to document or contribute to anyone's anything illegal happening from our people. So like, I didn't mention this earlier, but sometimes there are like technical violations of the law by demonstrators. Like being in the street is technically breaking the law, right? It's pretty harmless, but the police treat that as like the worst offense you can do in Columbus feels like blocking traffic, right? Like that just elicits such a violent response from the police. So we're very careful about not getting that technical illegal activity on video, or we're definitely not going to like record that in our notes or anything like that, because we don't want to put anyone at risk.
Thank you. I'm going to pair these two questions together from Anna and Leah. How does one get involved with helping in the jail support project? And does NLG have a central database of observations?
Yes. So I should put our, if you want to be involved in our jail support, I think we would welcome more volunteers. I would email, I can put this in the chat, or Charlie, you can, if you don't mind. Our email address, ohio@nlg.org. If any of you know me personally, you can reach out to me too. But yeah, we're looking for more volunteers for our jail support team for sure. So I would send an email. That's probably the best way to connect.
Yeah, and Leah.
What was the second question? Oh, a data. Yeah, we do have a, that's something we keep confidential for obvious reasons, but we do have a list of all the demonstrations and protests that we've supported over the years. Yeah, and here in Columbus.
I think you got to this in your presentation, but can a request be made for legal observers at a specific time and place for like actions and protests?
Yes. So I don't know if I did mention that. I'm sorry if I didn't, but there is again, if you know me personally, you can just reach out to me directly. But we have on our website, the Ohio NLG website, there's a form to request legal observers. So we have legal observer programs in Columbus, obviously, but also Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Toledo. So there are forms for each major city in Columbus, and you just fill out the form and submit it, and I'll eventually get it, and then I'll reach out to you and get more details on whatever's happening, and then we'll organize legal observers. So yeah, you can definitely make requests. I should have mentioned that earlier.
And you can, and like anyone can kind of take on a role. You don't have to be a lawyer or a law student, correct?
Correct, yes. You just have to be trained by one of us as NLG legal observers. And like I said, you can't be affiliated with law enforcement or a prosecutor's office or a similar type of government agency.
Yes, that's important.
Yeah.
Becca asked a good question about, I've recently seen a lot of social media posts about performing de-arrests. Can you comment on this?
That's something that we're not technically involved in. You said de-arrests?
Yes, de-arrests.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, I've heard of from some friends who are doing that. I would, if I were a legal observer at an action where this is happening, where there's folks doing the arresting, I would appreciate knowing in advance, because that is risky in my view. Doing that, it's very risky, and people assume that risk knowingly. Sometimes not, but I, as a legal observer, that's not something that we would participate in, but I would want to know in advance, like I said, just because that's a risky activity and puts those people at risk of arrest too. So yeah, that's a good question.
Great, thank you. I'll pair these ones from Catherine and Tom. Catherine was asking if there's any trainings coming up for people who want to be legal observers. And then Tom kind of asked, are trainings like scheduled events? Have to set those up with like the LOs who agree to like train you kind of like more individually.
Yeah, so I do most of the trainings. There are a few others in the NLG in Columbus who've done trainings in the past. I think we're gonna have one hopefully in the next month, hopefully sooner, the next few weeks maybe. We try not to publicize our trainings because we don't want to be infiltrated, which we think has happened in the past. So I would email the ohio@nlg.org email address and say you're interested in a training, and one of our other board members will put you on a list, and then we'll send on an email when that training is happening. So yeah, we welcome people who want to be trained because we need more legal observers. And yeah, if you're interested, just let us know, send us an email.
And then Leah asked, are NLG legal observers different than like other LOs?
That's a funny question. So there should be, I mean, I don't particularly like intellectual property or trademarks or anything like that, but we do. Legal observers is a trademarked NLG phrase. So there should only be one group of legal observers in the country and in Columbus. So there are other groups that do legal observers and call themselves legal observers, which is fine, but they're gonna, I don't know that they've been through like the same training and have the same experience as us. We've had conversations with these other groups about training them and like integrating them into our NLG legal observer program. So you may see other people out who identify themselves as legal observers, which could be confusing. And they may even have green, yellow hats on too, but so that gets a little confusing. But technically there should only be one NLG legal observer program.
Champagne and like sparkling wine, right? It's like, it's all great, but
right.
like technically champagne's from France, you know?
Right. I didn't know that.
Right. All great work though, for sure. Are there any other questions that anyone has? I know that it's getting close to time, so I just want to make sure if someone has a last question or two. You can also do like a little emoji thing and I can unmute you. I'm gonna like, yeah, I can do that too so that you can talk for a moment. Anybody have any questions? Okay, if we sign up here, are we on your list to receive notice of the training? So the sign-in sheet that I put in is just for like Ohio Voice. If you'd like to get notification of, you know, of any other events that are coming up, I think you can sign up though on the website. Is that what you said, Kevin, earlier?
Send an email to our ohio@nlg.org. If you're interested in being trained in the future, you'll be added to our list, and then you'll be notified once we schedule a training.
Awesome.
And if you, like I said earlier, if you want to request legal observers for a protest, go to our, and I don't have our website address memorized, but it should be easy to find, Ohio NLG, our website, and there'll be a space to request legal observers. Should be pretty easy, hopefully.
Thanks, Mike. Mike put it in there for the chat for us.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
Okay, I'm just looking through one more time to make sure no one's doing any reaction emojis. And then I need to unmute someone to ask any last minute questions. See some really awesome people on, so thank you for joining. I will put the sign-in sheet in here one more time. Let's see. If we're known by the police, would we not be good choices for legal observers? That's a pretty good one because I've thought about that myself. So.
That is a good question. I don't want to tell someone they shouldn't be a legal observer. It's all about what your own level of personal risk, what you're willing to do. I mean, they know, I'm thinking of someone in particular, I'm thinking of several people. They know, and they will target people that they don't like. So, I mean, but that would happen even if you were there not as a legal observer, right? So the only thing that I would add to that is it's impossible to do our jobs if you're in police custody, if you're arrested. So, and again, I don't want to exclude anyone, but it's all about your personal risk. And if you, I'm sorry, this is not a good answer. You're certainly welcome to volunteer, to be trained and volunteer. And Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm gonna stop the recording here.